Well, let me welcome all of you to chat with Matt. I'm really thrilled to have our guest speaker here today, Mike Lorelli. He's my go-to guy in all things private equity, and he's been a very good friend for the past 20 plus years. As I like to joke, I have a lot of old friends, and some of them are really old. Not as old as me, though. I'm getting up there. So having fun doing this, and on Chat with Matt, I tried to find people who have something really important to share with all of you. And in terms of careers, there can be nothing more important than private equity. I have a search practice, as many of you might know, and most of my clients are looking for CFOs for their portfolio companies. Very important audience, and Mike is going to share with you a lot of thoughts about how you need to approach them and what it's all about. So without any further ado, I'm going to spotlight Mike, and he and I are going to have a conversation. I know everybody prefers to do death by PowerPoint, but I'm not a big fan of it. So Mike and I are going to have a conversation, and I'd ask all of you to make sure your microphone is muted. Normally, you have to tell people to shut off their cell phones, but on Zoom, you don't have to do that. So, Mike, why don't you start, as is our tradition, by introducing yourself to everybody?
Sure, great, Matt, and it's always a delight to talk to the FANG group. So, I'm Mike Lorelli. The career consists of very pleasurably having been the CEO of Pepsi back in the 80s and 90s when we owned the restaurants. I also ran Pizza Hut for them for a while. The last 2 decades, I've been in the private equity space. And as I frequently said, it's a great place, I think, for just about everybody on this call to be thinking about for a good number of reasons. One of which is it's the only place I've found on the planet where gray hair is a plus.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Mike. They literally don't care how old you are as long as you're still breathing. If you can't fog a mirror, they have no interest in you. But as long as you can and you know how to do things, they are very interested. I've actually presented candidates in their 70s to private equity groups. So very important piece of information. I think overall, if we can get started with your normal sequence of events here, I know you like to talk about the decline in public companies.
Yeah, so it's a terrific topic, and there was an excellent Wall Street Journal op-ed piece a couple of years ago submitted by the head of research at Carlyle, very prominent private equity firm, that commented on that as of the date that op-ed appeared, there were only 3,600 public companies left in the United States with over 500 million in revenue. Now, when most people read that op-ed piece, their perception was 10,000, not 3,600. How could the Wall Street Journal not have a proofreader? How could they have such a blunderous typo? Well, it wasn't a typo. The number was 3,600 as a result of all of the M&A over 4 decades. Now, one of the reasons why I enjoy that article so much is that it brings a great contrast to private equity, which instead of shrinking like the public arena has, private equity's exploded to the point where today there are 16,800 portfolio companies. That's a lot of CEO roles, a lot of CFO roles, a great hunting ground for just about everybody on this call today.
Yeah. How many private equity groups are there?
Well, it's probably, yeah. So easily, the numbers between 4,000 and 5,000 now. In the US, just a little over 3,000. That's a boatload. Now, most people think private equity has been around forever. It really is interesting to do a little chronology here. It was only in the 70s when Kohlberg, Kravitz, and Roberts, who worked together at Bear Stearns, left Bear Stearns and started KKR. So that was the very first, at the time, known as leveraged buyout group. 1 year later, there were 80 of them. Today, 4,000 in the US, 5,000 around the world. Boxcar number, a very rich audience to be targeting.
So that, they target, I know this isn't really on our agenda, but they've been targeting the middle market firms uh, owned by baby boomers. And maybe you can walk us through what's happened in the marketplace. I know they're really searching now. There was a lot of low-hanging fruit. Now, not so much.
Yeah. So the good news, Matt, is that there's an abundance of capital that's been pledged by the limited partners, and we'll talk about the LPs in a few minutes. That's been pledged by the LPs to help us go out and find transactions, because nobody's making any money while money is pledged. It only makes money when it effectively gets deployed. But as Matt's highlighting, it's getting a little tougher these days. Now that interest is coming up, we're competing, against other, uses of capital. So, we got to sharpen our pencils a little bit more. It's a little bit harder to generate the returns, but the returns still are there, and they're very materially better than the other places where people could be investing their money. And that's the reason why year after year, all these limited partners keep coming back with even greater pledges for us to go out and find transactions.
Do you see that changing now that interest rates are climbing?
Well, I
For
think
example, I've read that some of the pension plans, their need for money and their abhorrence for risk, they're pulling some of their money back. That now they can get bonds with some kind of interest rate.
Well, there were two reasons why that's happening. One is because interest rates have risen. So there are other avenues that before were offering negligible returns that are now offering, well, at least single-digit returns. That's better than zero. But the other dynamic going on is that we're being pushed for distributions. A lot of the money that's been pledged to us is coming from retirement programs, CalPERS being a great example. And as the baby boomers are aging and they're approaching or in retirement age, they're looking for, their retirement benefits. So these LPs come to us and they want us to actually close out transactions, have sales, so that we can return capital to them.
So in terms of where the private equity groups invest their money, I think it'd be important to draw a distinction between venture capital and private equity.
Yeah. And
I don't know that that's clear to everybody.
Yeah. And a lot of people confuse the two, if not even use the two terms interchangeably, venture capital and private equity, but they're two completely different universes. So if I could just quickly explain it,
Please.
The VC world is interested in startups, early stage. It may be pre-revenue. It could be nothing more than an idea. It could be a molecule in a test tube. It certainly could be something that's in a test market in Syracuse, hasn't been expanded, across the US or a broader geography. That's the VC world. The private equity world is completely different in that the only kinds of transactions we look at are companies that already have scale, right? They can generally point to an LTM positive EBITDA, last 12 months, positive cash flow. Now, it could be broken today and losing money, but at some point in time, it was built to scale and did have a positive LTM EBITDA. So that's a big difference between the VC world, which could be startups, emerging companies, losing money, could simply be an idea. Private equity is interested in things that have already been built, scaled, and generally are profitable.
One thing that I've observed that I'd love to have you comment on, I've seen over the last 15 years, the private equity groups are much more focused on value creation. They were preliminary, my view was just they grossed up the balance sheet and just the money rained down. Now they're very much focused on value creation.
Well, and value creation comes about by bringing in seasoned operating executives.
Yes.
People that came from line operating roles and people that came from financial roles. Those are the people that know how to grow the top line, how to accelerate the revenue, how to improve gross margin. In short, bring about positive EBITDA the right way, not by financial engineering. So all of that bodes well for people that have literally been involved either in operating a business, have had responsibility for a P&L, or have at least been close enough, to those parts of the equation. But bodes well for people with financial skills and people with marketing and sales skills.
I used to go to the private before COVID. I used to go to the Private Equity International Operating Partners meeting, and originally my view was the operating partners were kind of stepchildren, and now they're very much valued as team players and getting the part of all of the benefits and the money they're generating by managing all the portfolio companies well.
Yeah. And, we should just also comment here on the sectors that private equity is involved in, if that would be helpful, Matt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, this is kind of interesting because PE plays in just about every space that exists. Most notable as of late, software has become more and more prominent, and in particular, SaaS, software as a service. Healthcare has become very prominent in the last couple of years as well. I would say both of those have grown probably at the expense of manufacturing, which is not quite in the limelight that it used to be. But still, the bottom line is that private equity plays in all sectors. And I find this a very interesting subject because when I think about people with financial backgrounds, people who are on this call today, I always think of people coming up through the financial ranks and people who come up through the HR ranks, basically as being category agnostic. The skills that you learn from being a good finance person or a good HR person are skills that are very easily transplanted from one sector to another. I'm going to use myself as an example here. I get labeled as a consumer person when people see Pepsi, pizza, and some other companies in my background, and that's fine. I don't mind being labeled as a consumer products person. But the truth of the matter is, one private equity firm had me go run a latex foam manufacturing business. Boy, that had nothing to do with pepperoni and Diet Pepsi. I ran the world's largest industrial burn care products company. Boy, that sure had nothing to do with pepperoni and Diet Pepsi. But I was able to transfer skills and prove that I could very easily be parachuted into another kind of situation and quickly learn the parameters and what the leverage points were. And those are the things that people with a financial background can very easily demonstrate it, because very frequently in their own careers, they've been parachuted from one situation to another, from one sector to another, and may have been part of the same conglomerate. So all that bodes well for people with financial skills because they've been doing this transplanting before.
Yeah, I don't think we covered the limited partner versus general partner definition. There's a little terminology for the group.
So it's very helpful to understand the terminology, to Matt's point. So the LPs, limited partners, those are the people giving us these pledges of money for us to go out and hunt and go find companies to go buy, build, and sell. So the limited partners, there's a misperception out there that it's a bunch of fat cats, a bunch of cigar smoking guys in the corner of a dimly lit room. The opposite is the case. The LPs largely are pension funds. They could be private pension funds. It could be my PepsiCo retirement fund. They could be public pension funds, the most obvious and most well-known being CalPERS, California Education Public Retirement System out there on the West Coast. So those are the LPs. Those are the people who are pledging us money to go buy, build, and sell companies. They refer to me, the private equity person, as the GP or general partner. That's the distinction. The LPs are giving us the money. The private equity firm, we are the PE.
Do they interfere a lot, from what you understand?
Well, I would say.
What's that interaction all about?
Yeah. So generally, it's constructive. I would say it's polite pressure. They do make phone calls and say, "Hey, Mike, I see you've owned Rita's Italian Ices now for 4 years. It looks like you're generating a nice IRR so far in the 20s. Don't you think we should be thinking about selling that soon? Because we'd like to have a distribution." That's an actual phone call I took from CalPERS. My response at the time, which was very fact-based, was, if you're online, I'd like to send you my latest Excel model, which shows you're right. The IR right now is in the low 20s, but the model says if we hold on to this thing just another 12 months, another 3 quarters, maybe 4 quarters, the IRR will be in the low 30s. Shouldn't we have a little bit more patience, and wait to get that far better IRR? So the answer to your question is, there's generally a very polite dialogue between the LPs and the PE. I would say it's polite pressure that could be applied. Largely, it comes in the form of, shouldn't we be looking at selling one of the companies because they'd like to have a distribution? But that's a healthy, constructive dialogue.
It's not that kind of direct interference like the private equity groups might do with their portfolio companies. It's much more reserved. They're just suppliers of money, and you have to listen to them. He who has the money, he who has the gold makes the rules, right?
Yeah. So I would say it's more than just listen to them, because when we finish the fund, hopefully with good results, or we shouldn't be in business, guess what? We're going to go out and raise our next fund, which means we're going to go out and get on an airplane, do our own road show. And the first people we're going to visit are the existing limited partners. Hopefully they're happy campers, and they'll re-up and they'll give us new pledges for the next fund that we go out and create. So yes, it's very important that we give them a very careful and very genuine listening attitude.
So how do they design these funds? I know they have a timeline and they promise to return all the money after X number of years. Maybe you can explain that logic to us.
Yeah. So typically, a private equity fund, when it's launched, will first of all comment on the size of the fund that they've raised, how much in pledge money they've received. They'll comment on the sector or sectors that they're looking at. They may say consumer, they might say restaurant, they might say branded products. I'm using these consumer examples, but it could just as easily be IT examples, could be energy examples, could be healthcare examples. They'll talk about the time frame. Generally, that's 10 years. And in that time frame, they expect to buy, build, and sell. They'll put out the approximate number of companies they think will live through that cycle of the fund. Generally, it's about 10 companies. And then you get out on your mission. You're out buying, building, and selling, taking those nice, polite, pressured calls from the LPs to transact sooner rather than later. Now, but even though the fund itself might last 10 years, the average hold period for one individual company right now is 5.25 years. So that's a very interesting stat to keep in mind, 5.25 years. That's a good statistic to ask about if you're interviewing to be parachuted in to a private equity portfolio company. One of the first things you want to find out is, where is it in their hold period? If they just bought it last year, well, that's terrific. You've got lots of runway in front of you. Your stock options are going to have a lot of time to appreciate in value, hopefully as a result of your efforts, as well as their CEO's efforts. On the other hand, if they're parachuting you in very late in the cycle, year 6, year 7, year 8, that raises a lot of red flags to you. Why are they changing the scenery? Why are they changing the management team so late in the game? Plus, PS, you don't know who your next boss is going to be. Odds are they're going to be selling this company next year, or worst case, the year after. You don't know who the next private equity firm is going to be. That's another reason why it's always good to know where the particular portfolio company is in the hold period. It helps you negotiate a better package. If it's very late in the cycle, you've got good grounds to argue for a 3-year severance package. And your argument simply and realistically is going to be, you don't know who your next boss is going to be. On the other hand, if they're parachuting you in and they just bought this thing 6 months ago, you've got very, very little ground to argue for a significant severance package. So those are kind of some of the reasons why you want to ascertain where is it in that hold period in that private equity fund.
Right. So what I tell my candidates when I'm introducing them to private equity groups is that they should also be aware of the risk factor, and the risk factor it circles around whether they have to move. If it's a local opportunity, you don't have to move. There's no risk. even if it's at the end of the hold period, you should probably take it.
Now, well, the good news here, Matt, is, and this was accelerated by the pandemic, I would say even 20 years ago, people really didn't care a whole heck of a lot on where you lived. I ran a company for 2 years in Deerfield Beach, Florida. I commuted. And I told the private equity firm up front, I would get the first flight out of LaGuardia Monday morning. I would get the last flight back out from Fort Lauderdale into New York on Thursday afternoons. I'd work at my home office on Fridays, and everybody was totally cool with that. Most recently, Matt, as you know very well, I ran a company, Accent Foods, down in Austin, Texas. Same thing. I commuted. And P.S., my COO lived in Virginia. My CFO lived in Nashville. We basically saw each other on Wednesdays, and who cared? So it's just a very different world today in terms of geography. All that is good news. You really don't have to buckle down and transplant yourself in addition to your household.
Yeah, for the top people, sometimes you just don't have to show up. It's exciting. Things have changed in accounting over the last 20, 25 years. Almost everybody was accessing all the accounting records. All of us CFO types were accessing the accounting information remotely, but we were in the office doing it. We didn't quite realize we could be anywhere. Never occurred to anybody. So it's an exciting development. So let's go over the LBO model. Now that everybody's seen you, we'll put you out in the corner, and we'll go over the LBO model. Share my screen.
Yeah, this is probably my favorite slide in this PowerPoint. So, and I'm assuming that most people on this call already understand it, but just for the sake of completeness, let me go through it just the same. So I found this company, I'm making this up obviously, with 90 million in EBITDA. I value it at 9x, so I'm going to pay $810 million for it. I'm going to put 300 in cash in to buy that company. That's cash that I'm going to fund from the pledges I've received from my limited partners, the LPs. The balance I'm going to raise using debt. I'll go to my favorite bank. In the old days, it might have been GE Capital. In my own case, doesn't exist any longer. Fast forward, let's say, to that 5.25 years, that average hold period. I've grown this company successfully from the 90 million in EBITDA to 120. The next private equity firm is willing to pay me a higher multiple. They're going to pay me 10x. Keep in mind, I bought it for 9x. They're going to pay me 10x. I made money just on that multiple arbitrage just by itself. The fact that I bought it for 9x, sold it for 10x. But in addition to that, and here's where the leverage comes in, I've increased the EBITDA to 120 million. So my sale price is $1.2 billion. I paid down a little bit of debt. I'm never in a hurry to pay back the debt. So my debt is now 300 from the 510. Proceeds after I pay off the note, $900 million. Keep in mind, we put 300 in, we're getting 900 out. That's a 3 times cash on cash return. If everything looked as beautiful, our life would be incredibly rosy. And we could talk about in a couple of slides, if you like, Matt, what the other parameters are that we get measured by. But this is one example. Cash on cash return is probably the most popular metric that private equity firms use.
Oh.
And speaking of which, so that one example, which was a 3x, there's nothing wrong with the 2x. I sold a couple of companies for a little bit more than doubling people's money. Nobody complained. Sure, they would have liked, a higher multiple than that, but nobody complained about my doubling their money. 5x happens, not too often, but when it happens, that's stratospheric. That's terrific. IRR is another measure, very popular. We all know what that is. Anything in the 20s is a very good IRR. If you can break into the 30s, that's stratospheric. The last measure, which again is not as important to me, but it's important to my LPs, is hold period. How long did I keep that business before I gave the cash back to my limited partners? So again, for me as the private equity firm, the 2 major drivers in my world are IRR and cash on cash return. You can see what the averages are. Hold period is also something that I track. Less important to me, more important to my limited partners.
Great.
Now, this is really the fun part, Matt. because life is not all that rosy in private equity land. So for a typical 10 company fund, and I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that that would be on average, we set out to buy, build, and sell companies in this new fund roughly over a 10-year time frame, even though the average hold period is only 5.25 years. Here would be the typical 10 company result. A couple out of the park, stratospheric, okay? These things are marvelous. I wish they could happen all day long. But in our game, base hits matter a heck of a lot, and they short count too. Triples, doubles, singles matter. But yes, 2 times out of 10, and this is the average for all private equity, 2 times out of 10, the bank took the car keys. Now, what does that literally mean? What that means is that I might get a phone call from a very unhappy limited partner, or not limited partner, but rather the note holder, saying, hey, Mike, you've been in violation of the loan covenants now for 3 consecutive quarters. The loan agreement says if you're in violation of the loan covenants for 2 consecutive quarters, we could take possession of the company. I'm calling you today to tell you, Mike, that we intend to do this on Monday. Let's do this as peacefully as we can. It happens 2 times out of 10. Now, in spite of that 2 out of the 10, the rest of the base hits and hopefully a couple out of the park more than make up for that, or I wouldn't still be in business as a private equity.
And that would be a shame.
Yes, indeed, Matt. Thank you.
So the funnel.
Well,
I think this is what everybody calls deal flow, right?
yes. And there are a couple of great points to make from this. Number one is, and I don't mind saying this, we actually do work pretty hard for the money that we get paid. In the course of a year, a typical private equity firm would look at 300 teasers. The teaser is the one pager that highlights a transaction by the investment banker that's representing the sale of the company. I might look at 300 teasers in the course of a year. I'll then sign the confidentiality agreement and look and actually get electronically 100 books, meaning 1 out of 3 times. Now, a book is a good 4-hour read. I'll probably read 2 books a week. That's a fair amount of work. That's an evening's activity easily. I'll go in and hold meetings with management 20 times out of those 100, out of the 300 teasers. I'll start spending serious money and time writing 7 letters of interest, letters of intent, LOIs. I'll then go out and spend more money doing due diligence on 2 to get 1 over the finish line. 300 teasers to get 1 transaction over the finish line. There is a heck of a lot of work from the top of that funnel, as you appropriately labeled it, Matt, deal flow, to get to that 1 on the bottom. But this is the world we live in. Very important model for you to keep in mind. Frequently, I hear from people, I've emailed this private equity firm and they just haven't responded. In fact, I've pinged them a couple of times. They still haven't responded. Well, the reason that they're not responding isn't because they're bad people. It's not because they're trying to ignore you. It's because they're busy. They're looking at 300 teasers to get 1 over the finish line. The last thing in the world they have time for is someone that comes across as unemployed and is not offering anything. On the other hand, someone who positions themselves as having a potential transaction, man, I'm going to return that phone call real fast. This person is of keen interest to me, and we can come to that in a couple of slides, Matt.
Sure. So these are the 300 teasers you get. Does the private equity group send you all the teasers when you are in that kind of a relationship?
Yeah. So yes, so largely those teasers would come from the private equity firm, but a good number of them come from my own connections and contacts being in the business. So you never know where it's going to come from.
Sure. Okay. Cool. So you should go circle back to who the private equity groups really want to meet. You were discussing it. But if you're a job seeker, I guess if you can bring people deals, right?
Yeah. So the point here is the person you're writing to is busy. That person is reading 300 teasers, again, looking at 100 books, on average in the course of a year, spending serious time visiting management teams, et cetera, et cetera. That person is pretty busy. The last thing they have time for is someone who positions himself as or herself as unemployed. That's just not a high interest topic for me. On the other hand, someone who says, hey, you know what? I know a little bit about company X. I think it's mismanaged. Here are the things that they're missing. Here are the things that are broken. I know how to fix these things. I think we could go in and make an offer and potentially get this company, get control of this company. Someone who comes across that way, I've got a lot of time for, because that person is going to help me get a proprietary transaction, something that doesn't go to auction. Auctions are horrible. And unfortunately, in most of the cases, transactions go to auction. The bad news about auctions is there's always a drunken sailor in the crowd that's going to overpay for a particular company. They've got to have it for whatever reason. Well, that's not a great environment for me to be in. On the other hand, if I've got a situation that looks like it could be proprietary, meaning it's not going out to bid, someone's got an inside view, an inside look, an instinct, well, that's the kind of person I absolutely will start spending some time with, again, because to help me generate a proprietary deal, not something that's going to auction where everybody is going to lose.
I went to an ACG meeting, Association for Corporate Growth meeting, and there was private equity executives and investment bankers, and the private equity executive said, every time an investment banker gets involved, the price goes up.
Very
so
true.
If you are a job seeker, how do you best present yourself?
Yeah. So it's helpful to stay abreast of transactions. You might subscribe to The Deal, which is a daily electronic publication. But by subscribing to The Deal, which is very inexpensive, you can see what companies are in play right now. And if it's a space that you've got some insight into and perhaps may have even worked in, you then have got some good grounds to approach the private equity firm, and your conversation or your email might be along the lines of, hey, I see that you're interested in pursuing the acquisition of XYZ. Several years ago, I was in the same space running XYZ janitorial valve company. I think I could be an asset to you as you're looking at that transaction. I could be another set of eyes as you're reviewing the confidential information memorandum, the SIM, as it's most popularly called. Someone who positioned themselves as a deal resort. Now I've got a good ear to listen to this person. They're going to help me. They're just not looking for employment. And that's a key distinction. Someone's going to help me as opposed to someone who's looking for employment. Key distinction, Matt.
So you shared a statistic with me that you don't have to have previously worked in private equity to get a job in private equity.
48% of the people that are in CEO and CFO positions in private equity today, 48%, this is their first experience in private equity. That bodes well for everyone on this call. The second one, which I think is actually more important, is that in 47% of the cases where there are CFOs in private equity portfolio companies, this is that person's first CFO assignment. I really enjoy that stat. Private equity people are willing to take a gamble on a jockey, a smart person, even if they haven't held the role before. Very important for people on this call. Private equity has a real open mind toward people who haven't done it, as long as they're bright and can prove that they can transfer skills, quickly acclimate to a new environment, and launch their 100-day plan, even before they start.
I understand there's a question, Peggy.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, Mike, that seem to be. One of them was they would like to know what industries are the most ripe for private equity investors.
Software, healthcare would be very closely tied for number one and number two, Peggy. After that, it's the full gamut, every sector that exists, right down to materials and mining, another what you might call boring categories. But I would say software and healthcare easily are the two hottest today.
Okay, and then they wanted to know
From
what
that chart you shared, from that chart you shared with me, it seemed like manufacturing was the only category that was underrepresented.
Yeah, and
I was surprised.
yeah, well, certainly if you wound back the clock 36 months, that wouldn't be the case. Manufacturing would have been number one, but clearly, the world is shifting, away from being a manufacturing environment and culture. Certainly our country has shifted away from being a manufacturing country, and that's where these more electronic and technically oriented categories are becoming, hotter and hotter. Software, number one, and healthcare, because large parts of healthcare can be driven faster and better with the use of technology. So for those two reasons, healthcare and software, Peggy, I would put number one and number two.
Okay. And then the next question was, what industries really don't make great targets and why?
Well, I would say even my lifeblood consumer products is less glamorous than it had been years ago. Not for any particular reason other than the fact that other categories have kind of moved into the stardom. I wouldn't really single out any category. Certainly, I used the expression earlier about boring categories, mining, minerals, materials, those kinds of things. I personally find a little less, glamorous. But again, private equity plays everywhere. And that's one of the fun things about coming up through a financial background or HR background, as I mentioned previously, is that people that come through those two suits, are very category agnostic. The skills are very easily transferable, from one sector to another. Bodes well for everybody on this call.
So
okay, and then there was another.
Wait a minute. So I'm taking from this that not only will private equity groups consider people who are older, but they'll also consider people who are not really on target for their particular industry requirement.
And I'll use myself.
That's an interesting observation.
Yeah. And I'm using myself as the example. Here's a ex-Pepsi and pizza person who's running the world's largest industrial burn care products company. Talk about a sector, by the way, that's not terribly glamorous. Industrial burns. Well, that's about as far, from my background, as one could get. But it didn't matter. I interviewed very well with the private equity firm, Rutledge Capital, owned it at the time. And I talked about how I could transfer skills, how I've walked into every assignment, having well thought out in advance what my own personal 100-day plan, was going to look like, so that I landed on my feet running. I'm glad you pushed out that article, by the way, about interim roles, Matt.
Yes.
It's really becoming a more and more frequent kind of assignment, these interim engagements. And they're looking for people who could be quick studies, people who could be parachuted in, people who will land on their feet with a 100-day plan even before they start. I'd like reading actually in your notes last week, one of the points that you made in your evening letter was about, you're never really employed. You're actually just
Only between searches.
You just between engagements, that's very, very true today. The point I'm making, though, and I'm taking a little bit too long to say it, is that interim roles are increasingly out there. Great place for people with financial backgrounds to play.
Yeah, Peggy, there's another question.
There were a few more. And also, Mike, they wanted, or Matt, are you going to make Mike's slides available? Some people wanted that.
Probably not.
Okay. Mike,
This meeting is being recorded and you can play it back again.
Okay. Long-term incentive plan for PE companies. Do you have any information about that?
Well, maybe you can just address this broadly about what kind of money a private equity CFO can look forward to.
Yeah. So the bad news here is that I never made cash what I made as a Pepsi president. My cash components, meaning my salary and bonus pieces, were lighter than what I made as a Pepsi CEO or a Pepsi president. On the other hand, all of the CEO situations that I've undertaken in PE land, I generally had 5% of the equity, not handed to me day one, but in the form of stock options if I met certain hurdle rates. But that 5% of equity could have been worth and should have been worth many millions of dollars. A company that I tried to buy myself personally, that I got backed by private equity, the model that I showed was that me as the CEO could have made $11 million if I achieved my hurdles. My CFO, who would have been my right-hand person in that particular company, would have made $5.5 million. That's not so bad for 3 years worth of work. Okay.
Oh.
So the cash component is typically a lot lighter than what you're used to receiving and what you might be receiving right now in a traditional fortune-oriented kind of assignment. But where you make your money is with that equity piece. And again, 5% of the equity for the CEO would be typical, 3.5%, 3% for the CFO would be typical. And that piece by itself, that equity component, should be worth clearly in the millions of dollars. Not so bad for 3 years worth of work.
No.
And there was a question that kind of piggybacks on that they wanted to know if the amount of equity is related to how close the company is to exit.
Well, it's a complicated question, Peggy. So the answer is yes. The difficult thing here for me to answer without having the specifics is, where exactly is it in the whole period? And I'd really need to understand the compensation program and how many years the options that the individual had, were vesting over. So I can't give you just a sweeping general answer to that, Peggy. I apologize.
Nope, that's okay. Thank you. No more questions, Matt.
Okay, so why don't you explain how private equity groups make money?
Yeah.
What do they get?
Yeah.
I assume they're not doing this for charity.
No. So when we buy a company and we've now tapped the LPs to wire in the money, their share of the pledge that they made, I now start billing those LPs 2% of that money that they've given me to invest. I start now billing them 2% as my management fee, right? Now that 2% purely goes toward my keeping the shop open. It goes toward my rent. It goes towards salaries for key employees, my electric bill, and that's about it. No bonuses, no long-term compensation. When I sell a company on the exit side, the first thing I have to do is pay back every one of the LPs 100 cents on a dollar. Okay. So now they've been made whole. They haven't made money, but at least they've gotten back 100 cents on the dollar. Once I've done that, then I take 20% of the profit that's still on the table. I put that in my pocket, me as the private equity person, the GP, the general partner. That's what's referred to as carried interest. Then the balance that's on the table, and there sure better be a lot or I wouldn't be in business, the balance goes out in proportion to what the LPs pledged originally. So the waterfall effect on the exit side is, first I've got to get the LPs back whole, meaning pay them back 100 cents on the dollar. After I've done that, then to the next 20% of the profit goes to me as the general partner, the GP, the private equity firm. That's what's referred to as the carried interest. Then what's still left on the table, and there better be a significant amount, goes back to the limited partners in proportion to what they paid in. Now, in spite of that, which seems like a very long waterfall, in spite of those various tranches, I am still giving back to those LPs returns in the 20s and sometimes in the 30s. Those are the cash on cash returns, the IRRs, and the reason they keep coming back year after year after year. That's a really nice premium.
Perfect. So let's see. We should talk about what kinds of. This is the important part of the conversation. People want to know what private equity groups are looking for, and how the CFO role differs between traditional and private equity.
Well,
It's always viewed as a high pressure environment, and some people think the reporting is the reporting is a huge requirement because they keep track of all these things.
yeah, the point you're taking us to, Matt, is a really important one, because this gets to the way you want to come across in the interview.
Yes.
Right? You want to come across as a scrappy person who thrives on minimum resources. As an example here, in one interview that I recall, which goes back a good number of years though, they asked me to describe my last private equity environment and what it was like a day in the office for me. And I said, well, one of my favorite stories is that the next day we had our bank meeting, and I was the least busy person. So I walked up and down the cubicles and I said, Staples, Staples, and going to Staples. Does anybody need anything? And people told me what they needed from the Staples. And because I was the least busy guy and we needed to get binders for the bank meeting tomorrow, Mike Lorelli, as the CEO, was the one who drove the Staples. Now, I give you that little silly example of how I played back in an interview setting what a day in the life was like, because it did well position me how I could be a very scrappy person. I didn't need staffs. In these private equity, situations, there are no administrative assistants. There's no receptionist. There's a phone with a list of extensions in the lobby, and that's it. So you've got to be able to operate in these very, very scrappy environments. Keep in mind, you as the CFO should take possession of writing the strategic plan. By no means do you have several $1 million to bring McKinsey in to do it, and the CEO shouldn't be the one writing it. If I were the CFO of a private equity portfolio company, I would be the one raising my hand saying, you know what? We owe the strategic plan to the private equity firm. We're coming up on a year. Let's give it to them at least a couple of months in advance. Here's who's going to do what to whom, by what timeline. Take possession of writing the strategic document yourself as the CFO. A great example of the kind of things you could be talking through and the things that you do well while you're in the interview mode.
Yeah, it's a high pressure environment. They expect people who are going to go in there and get things done. So how do you sell yourself? I think that leads us into your LinkedIn profile story.
Yeah. So this is a fun topic, Matt. People have an underappreciation for how important a killer LinkedIn profile truly is. And I'm glad we've got this graphic up on the screen. So there are 720 million LinkedIn members. LinkedIn has become the go-to vehicle for us to find people if we need to put a C-level executive in one of our portfolio companies. Inside of 1 hour, I could put the adjectives in that describe the kind of individual I'm looking for. Inside of 1 hour, I could skim through 50 or 60 profiles. I'll only spend 1 minute a piece on them, and I'll put people into 1 or 2 piles, my A pile and my trash pile. I'm going to try to get this list down from 50 or 60 down to about 10. I'm going to give that pile of 10 to one of the newly minted MBAs. I'm going to say, go telephone screen, tell me which 2 people we should fly in. That's how the majority, and I would say statistically, about 85% of the positions get filled from the LinkedIn profiles. And by the way, if they found you by some other means, the first thing that anybody does, and I'm sure people on this call do this all the time, if you're going to go meet or talk to somebody tomorrow that you don't already know, first thing you're going to do is look at their LinkedIn profile, get a little bit more background on the person. So the point I'm making here, I'm taking a little bit too long to explain it, is you've got to have a killer LinkedIn profile. Now, I'd like to show the people on our call today, Matt, 2 things that are critical to have a killer LinkedIn profile. Number 1 is the headline. People waste space putting in the headline what their present assignment is or what their last day job was. Nobody cares. The only person who's going to go and do a LinkedIn query and put in CIO for Staples, the only person who's going to go in and do a query like that is that person's mother or boyfriend or girlfriend. Don't waste that valuable headline space telling me what your day job is. Instead, use those critical, precious few headline characters to put in the words, the adjectives that someone might use if they were doing a LinkedIn query. So as an example here, Matt showing on the screen, my own profile says CEO, interim CEO, outside director, private equity, operating partner, board coach. Those are all keywords that somebody might use if they wanted to find someone with a background like my own. By the way, also notice the punctuation. You want to separate those keywords with those vertical bars, also known as spikes. Too many people, I see their LinkedIn profiles, they use forward slashes or bullets. The algorithm has no idea what to do with a forward slash or a bullet in a headline. You've got to use those vertical bars, spikes as they're referred to separate the keywords. That's point number one on a LinkedIn profile. Point number two on the LinkedIn profile is the about section. A good example of an about section begins with an excellent, short, tight elevator speech, maybe 3 or 4 sentences, nothing longer than that, and follow that opening elevator speech, so to speak, with 2 or 3 subheads that describe what separates you from 1,000 other people. So again, my 2 keys on LinkedIn are, number one, keep in mind you've got precious few headline characters. There's actually 150 available spaces there. Fill it out first with the keywords that describe what you represent. Make sure you punctuate it correctly. Then in the about section, give me a very short, tight elevator speech, 3 or 4 sentences most, followed by the 3 or 4 subheads that describe what separates you from 1,000 other people. Those would be the keys to an effective LinkedIn profile.
Thank you. So if you're writing to PE firms, going along with that, you want to emphasize what do you want to emphasize in your background?
Yeah. So I would say if you're writing to a private equity firm, really simple. 2 most important things you could do. Number one, keep it short, right? Meaning a half a page. If you send somebody an email that's longer than a half a page, it just demonstrates you have no ability to be concise. Personally, when I get an email that's longer than a half a page, I can't hit the delete key fast enough. So my point number one would be keep it short, half page max. Number 2, make effective use of bullets. Bullets make it very easy for the eyeballs to drink it in, so to speak. There's nothing worse than when you open up an email and it's paragraphs and paragraphs. It looks like someone just shipped you a novel. Same thing. I can't hit the delete key fast enough. So I would say if you're writing to a private equity firm, keep it short, half page max, make effective use of bullets.
Yeah. So the email is in my world too, is I try to get people to give me the most important things about them. And then of course they can attach their resume if I have interest and want to go further.
Yeah, and Matt, by the way, while we're on the subject of LinkedIn, I would invite everybody on our program today to connect with me on LinkedIn. I am what's referred to as a super connector in the space. I've got over 10,000 connections. I'm sure you're in the same category, Matt. Simply being connected with a super connector like Matt or like myself, simply being connected to a super connector actually raises you in the rankings in LinkedIn when someone is doing a query. So by all means, I would invite everybody on this call, connect with me on LinkedIn. My email address is mklorelli, Lorelli @gmail.com. If you're sending me an email, just put FANG in the subject line and I'll know it's important and I will read it and I will connect. Thank you.
Did you want to talk briefly about a typical private equity board?
Yeah, sure.
I know we go into great detail on the board landings discussion we've done previously, but just a quick overview.
Yeah, so the board is pretty small. It would be the CFO, CEO rather, for sure. CFO optional. 3 people from the private equity firm so that they can control it. So that typically would be the deal team. And 2 outside directors. Very, very small board. That's in contrast to a public situation where there may be as many as 7 independent directors. Again, in the private equity setting, only 2. By the way, this is a very interesting area also for people on this call. Everybody in our universe on this call today should be thinking about board seats. It's a prime area. People with CFO backgrounds are fertile turf to be populating these independent director roles. I run a program called Landing Board Seats. People can learn more about it by visiting my website, which is fasterlandings.com, www.fasterlandings.com.
Yeah, I've got it up on the screen, Mike.
Oh, great, great, great. By the way, notice on my business card, I put down independent director, executive coach, CEO, interim CEO. Everybody in this call should be putting down CFO, interim CFO. Even if you haven't done it, belongs on your business card.
So I'll just leave that up. Any things we missed? Well,
I think you've covered the bandwidth, Matt, as you always do, in your jam-packed 60 minutes.
yeah. So last questions. And Peggy, you watching the chat box? Any last?
Yeah,
We have a couple of minutes here. I try to make meetings start and end on time, but I'm sure we can impose on Mike to stay a few more minutes. So the question is,
I wanted to know, how do you find working with private equity operating partners and the executives? What, do you have any insights into that? That's a question.
Yeah, how do I find working on them? I would say intellectually engaging, never a boring moment. The average IQ, I would say, is about 160. That's not an exaggeration. They're a terrific and very challenging group to work with, and you won't be bored for a moment. And the rewards are certainly there too. There's tremendous financial payouts for people who are successful in this space.
And they would like to know, you mentioned the operating partners, they said, could you elaborate a bit on the roles of these people, their roles, and what a private equity firms are currently looking for in an operating partner, which is different than what you were speaking about?
Yeah. So in the operating partner role, you've got to have obviously an operating background, meaning you've run a P&L. But you've also got to be a good deal source, the kind of person that can sniff out situations, the person that can look at a SIN, confidential information memorandum, and see angles that other PEs don't see, which will enable you to legitimately bid a higher price, not because you're a drunken sailor, but because you saw an angle that other PEs didn't see. So I would say that visionary aspect, that ability to see around corners, so to speak, source good transactions, those would be additional traits that would make you a terrific executive operating partner. Rather, thank you.
Okay, I think we covered most of the questions, whether they're in the questions or you've already spoken about them. You're very concise and also very broad in giving us a lot of good information, Mike. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Peggy.
we had a wild ride here. You're sure? We have, we can take a couple more minutes if there's any additional questions, or if not, we'll thank Mike for his great presentation today. He's always a delight to work with. And he's very serious about accepting your LinkedIn request. If you're a member of this networking group, you must be pretty good. So that's what he goes by. Anything else? All right, well, we've reached the end of our hour. I just want to thank you, Mike, for being here today. We always have a great conversation, and as many times as I've heard you speak, I always learn something new. So thank you for that. Chat with Matt, I'm hoping to get more scheduled. I've been remiss in scheduling speakers, but it's hard to find people as good as Mike Lorelli. He's the gold standard. So Mike, thank you so much. And all of you stay safe, and we'll see you again on Chat with Matt.